Policemen laughed at the black woman in court, their mocking stares piercing through the room like daggers, their smirks dripping with arrogance, their amusement coming at her expense. They sat comfortably, their uniforms a shield of impunity, whispering among themselves, chuckling as if what was unfolding in that courtroom was nothing but a joke. The judge didn't seem to care, the spectators either looked away or joined in the quiet derision, and the prosecutor, who should have been the face of justice, stood in silent complicity. "Look at her," one officer murmured under his breath, loud enough for others to hear, his voice soaked in mockery. "Trying to sound smart. But at the end of the day, she's just another one of them. They always think they're special." Another one, the loudest among them, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed with an amused grin. "Bet she rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror, thinking it would make a difference." He let out a laugh, the kind of laugh that carried the weight of years of unchecked power, the kind that made blood boil, that told you no matter what you did, no matter how right you were, people like them would always see you as nothing. The woman stood there, absorbing every word, every chuckle, every smug glance. But she didn't react. Not yet. She held her breath, steady and composed, while her mind raced through every injustice, every time she had witnessed men like them abusing their power, every time she had swallowed her rage because she knew the world wasn't built to protect people like her. She had walked into this courthouse with dignity, but these men, these so-called officers of the law, were doing everything they could to strip it from her, to remind her where they believed she belonged. The prosecutor paced in front of her, pretending to be professional, pretending to follow the law, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't searching for truth. He was playing a game. And she was supposed to be the piece they would move at their will. "So let me get this straight," he began, voice dripping with fake patience. "You were stopped by these officers for a reason. Your attitude escalated the situation. You refused to cooperate. And now, you're here trying to convince this courtroom that you were the victim?" Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, already convinced by the mere presence of badges and uniforms. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. No one wanted to challenge the system, not when it had already chosen its favorite. She kept her face neutral, but inside, something was igniting, something deeper than anger, something more powerful than indignation. She had prepared for this. She had lived through this. And today, she would not be reduced to their expectations. One of the officers, the ringleader, leaned forward, his voice a condescending whisper meant to be heard. "You should have just kept your mouth shut, lady. Would have been a lot easier for you." Another smirked. "But they never learn, do they?" A chorus of low chuckles followed, casual, easy, like they had done this before, like this was just another day of making sure people like her knew their place. For a moment, she let the silence stretch, let their laughter fill the space, let them believe they had already won. And then, she spoke. "You seem very comfortable, officer." Her voice was calm, measured, but there was something beneath it, something sharp, something unwavering. "Laughing, whispering, enjoying yourselves. I imagine that's because you believe I'm powerless here." The room quieted slightly, but the arrogance in their eyes didn't fade. "You think this is just another case where you twist the truth and walk away untouched. Another moment where your uniform shields you from consequence. Another time where no one challenges you." She let her words settle, her gaze locking onto each of them. "But you should have done your homework before trying to humiliate me." The judge shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor frowned, sensing something off. The officers still smirked, still convinced this was some kind of weak attempt at intimidation. And then, she dropped the words that shattered their confidence in an instant. "I work for the CIA." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The smirks faded. The judge's gavel hovered over the desk but didn't drop. The prosecutor stiffened. And the officers, those who had laughed, mocked, belittled her, sat up straight, eyes darting to each other, searching for reassurance that wasn't there. "You think I don't know what you've done? That I don't have access to everything?" You think your department will protect you? Her voice was like steel now, cutting through every wall of privilege and corruption they had built around themselves. I know about the falsified reports. I know about the excessive force complaints that mysteriously disappeared. I know about the people who never made it out of your custody the way they went in. The color drained from the ringleader's face. The same man who had laughed the loudest now looked like he was struggling to breathe. You wanted to humiliate me. But you should have realized, I'm not the one on trial here. You are. A deadly silence took over the courtroom. The officers sat frozen, their confidence stripped away like a mask torn from their faces. The prosecutor, who had been so smug moments ago, shifted uncomfortably, already calculating the damage control needed. The judge, who had let the humiliation continue, suddenly seemed eager to move the proceedings along. But it was too late. Because at that moment, the doors to the courtroom opened. And what happened next would change everything. Before we begin, let's make one thing clear: Plow of Twist stands firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of storytelling to shine a light on real issues. To every Black viewer watching this, you are seen, you are valued, and your voice matters. This story is about resilience, justice, and turning the tables on those who abuse their power. Stay with us, because this one is going to be unforgettable. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more powerful stories like this. The city pulsed with the kind of energy that never quite let anyone rest. Washington, D.C., a place where power and corruption intertwined so seamlessly that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The marble halls of justice stood tall, gleaming in the midday sun, an illusion of fairness that masked the deeply embedded systems that had been designed to protect some while suffocating others. It was within this cold and indifferent structure that Naomi Carter found herself, standing alone, absorbing the weight of yet another attempt to diminish her existence. She had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in this exact situation. A place where she had to fight against something that should have never been a battle to begin with. A place where the odds were always stacked against her, no matter how right she was, no matter how much evidence she had, no matter how undeniable the truth was. She had learned, long ago, that justice was not blind, it simply chose what it wanted to see. Naomi was the kind of woman who never showed weakness, not because she didn't feel it, but because the world had never given her the luxury of vulnerability. She had worked too hard, pushed too far, and sacrificed too much to let herself crumble in front of men who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. She was brilliant, the kind of mind that could dismantle lies with precision, the kind of strategist who could see 3 moves ahead before anyone else even realized they were playing a game. And yet, none of that mattered to the men sitting across from her. To them, she was just a Black woman who had dared to challenge them. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, hushed conversations that never quite died down, eyes flickering toward her as if waiting to see her break. The air was thick with judgment, with the silent but deafening expectation that she would eventually back down, fold under the pressure, accept her place. But Naomi Carter had never been the kind of woman to yield. Sitting just a few feet away were Detective Mark Reynolds, Officer Chris Dwyer, and Sergeant Paul Whitmore, 3 men who had built their careers on the foundation of unchecked power. They weren't just police officers, they were the police. The ones who wrote the rules as they went, who decided what justice meant in real time, who had never faced real consequences for their actions because the system wasn't designed to hold men like them accountable. They carried themselves with the arrogance of those who believed they were untouchable, leaning back in their seats as if this entire proceeding was nothing more than an inconvenience. Reynolds was the worst of them. His confidence wasn't just built on years of power, it was built on knowing that no matter what he did, no matter how wrong he was, there would always be people willing to defend him. He had that easy smirk, the kind that sent chills down the spine of those who had been on the receiving end of his justice. He was the type of man who could plant evidence on a person, strip them of their dignity, and still sleep peacefully at night, convinced he was a hero. Dwyer was quieter, but no less dangerous. He had that look in his eye, the kind that told you he enjoyed the power too much, that the line between right and wrong had long since blurred for him. He wasn't the leader, but he followed without question, a loyal enforcer of Reynolds's will, a man who had never once challenged the authority he wielded. Then there was Whitmore, older, more seasoned, the kind of officer who should have known better but never cared enough to be better. He was the one who had seen it all, who had watched the world change around him and refused to change with it. He carried the weight of a generation that had been told they were the law, that their word was final, that they could do whatever they pleased because that was how it had always been. They had humiliated her. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the way they had laughed, the way they had spoken to her as if she were nothing, the way they had stripped her of her dignity without a second thought. They had treated her like a criminal before even knowing her name, before even hearing her speak. And now, as they sat in that courtroom, their confidence unshaken, their arrogance intact, they believed this was just another game. Another moment where they would walk away untouched. The judge barely glanced at her, an older man who had seen too many cases like this to care. The prosecutor, a man named Daniel Morton, had made it clear from the start that he wasn't on her side. He wasn't here to seek justice, he was here to close a case. To sweep the mess under the rug and move on. And the spectators? They were just here for the spectacle, for the chance to witness another moment where the powerful reminded the powerless exactly where they stood. Naomi's fingers curled into fists, but she forced herself to relax, forced herself to breathe. She had spent years mastering the art of self-control, of never letting them see her crack, of never letting them see that they had gotten to her. But this moment, this injustice, was testing every ounce of restraint she had. She could hear Reynolds chuckling again, low and smug, whispering something to Dwyer, who let out a quiet laugh. Whitmore didn't bother to hide his amusement, shaking his head like this was all just a waste of his time. Naomi had seen men like them before. She had spent her entire life dealing with men like them. But what they didn't know, what they had never considered, was that they had chosen the wrong woman to humiliate. She wasn't just another victim. She wasn't someone who would walk away quietly. She wasn't someone they could break. She had walked into this courtroom alone, but she wouldn't leave the same way. Because by the time this was over, by the time she was done, they would never forget her name. The prosecutor, Daniel Morton, adjusted his tie and stepped forward, his voice steady, measured, but filled with an unmistakable condescension that made Naomi's stomach tighten. He was a man who had built his career on keeping the powerful in power, on making sure the right people walked free while the wrong ones, people like her, were buried under layers of bureaucracy, technicalities, and strategic omissions. He wasn't looking for justice, he was looking to close this case with as little disruption as possible, to make sure that the men seated behind him, the men smirking with an infuriating confidence, left the courtroom untarnished. "Miss Carter," he began, emphasizing her last name like it carried less weight than the badge she had never revealed. "You claim that Detectives Reynolds and Dwyer, along with Sergeant Whitmore, unfairly targeted you during a routine stop. That they escalated the situation unnecessarily. That they, what was the exact phrase you used, humiliated you. Is that correct?" Naomi didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't let herself react the way they expected her to. She had learned, long ago, that these moments were never about what was right, never about the truth. They were about performance, about who could manipulate the narrative better, about who had the power to define reality. She was up against a system that had already decided what her role was supposed to be. "That is correct," she said, her voice even, her posture unshaken. Morton clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slightly, his movements designed to control the room, to make it feel like he was the one in command, like her presence here was nothing more than an inconvenience in his otherwise well-ordered day. "And yet, according to the police report, you were belligerent. You refused to comply with their lawful orders. You became hostile, causing the officers to take necessary action to protect themselves. Would you say that report is inaccurate?" A soft chuckle came from the defense table. "Reynolds. Naomi could hear the amusement in it, the arrogance. She forced herself not to turn, not to give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. "The report is fabricated," she said without hesitation, her eyes locked onto Morton's. "A complete misrepresentation of what happened." Morton tilted his head, feigning curiosity, feigning patience. "So you're saying that 3 decorated officers, officers with years of experience, officers who have risked their lives serving this city, lied? That they all conspired to make you look guilty? Why would they do that, Miss Carter?" Naomi's fingers tightened slightly, but she exhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm, keeping her expression unreadable. "Because they could." The courtroom was silent for a moment. Morton smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who believed he was in control. "That's quite an accusation," he said, shaking his head. "You seem to believe that these officers, men who have dedicated their lives to protecting the public, somehow singled you out. That they saw you and, what? Decided to humiliate you for fun? I'd like to understand why you believe that." She let the silence stretch for just a moment, let the weight of the question settle. "I don't have to believe it," she said, voice sharp, deliberate. "It happened." Morton sighed, as if she were exhausting him, as if her insistence on telling the truth was some minor inconvenience in his otherwise seamless case. And yet, these officers, men with families, with careers, with reputations, have everything to lose if they were caught lying. You, however, have everything to gain. You're painting yourself as the victim. It's convenient, isn't it? A slow, cold anger unfurled in Naomi's chest. Convenient. The word twisted inside her, mocking, dismissive, reducing her experience, her humiliation, to nothing more than a performance. Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Tell me, Mr. Morton. What exactly do I gain? What exactly does a black woman gain by standing in a courtroom full of people waiting for her to fail? By putting herself in a position where her dignity is dissected, her character questioned, where men like you twist the truth until it no longer resembles anything real? What, exactly, do you think I want from this?" Morton's expression faltered for just a second, but it was enough. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to make sure he heard her. "If you think I enjoy this, if you think I asked for this, then maybe you should take a moment to ask yourself why you're so desperate to defend men who didn't just break the law, but laughed while doing it." A shift in the room. A whisper, a murmur, a glance exchanged. For the first time, Morton hesitated. And for the first time, the men at the defense table stopped smirking. Naomi knew then that she had cracked something, something small, but something significant. The illusion of absolute control. The belief that this moment would pass without consequence. But they still weren't afraid. Not yet. The judge cleared his throat, bringing order back to the room, his patience thinning. "Mr. Morton, do you have a point to make, or are you just going to argue with the witness all day?" Morton straightened, clearing his throat. "Of course, Your Honor. I have just one more question." He turned back to Naomi, his expression controlled again, careful. "You're standing here, making serious allegations against these officers, claiming they abused their authority. That they humiliated you. That they escalated the situation. So tell me, Miss Carter, if what you say is true, if these officers are guilty of what you claim, then why should we believe you over them?" The silence that followed was heavy. The kind that seemed to press against Naomi's ribs, demanding an answer. She let it stretch, let the weight of the moment settle over the room, let them feel the gravity of what was about to happen. And then, she spoke. "You should believe me," she said, her voice calm, controlled, unshaken, "because I'm not just here as a witness." A flicker of confusion in Morton's eyes. The briefest hesitation from Reynolds, from Dwyer, from Whitmore. Naomi inhaled slowly, exhaling through her nose, keeping her composure, letting the tension build, letting the moment thicken with anticipation. "I'm here," she continued, voice unwavering, because I have the authority to expose them. The prosecutor frowned slightly, a crack in his confidence, the first hint of unease. Naomi tilted her head slightly, just enough for her next words to land like a hammer. And I'm not just speaking as Naomi Carter. She let that sink in, let the weight of the next revelation hover just before impact. Then, finally, she delivered the first blow. I work for the CIA. The room didn't just fall silent, it collapsed into silence. Reynolds stopped breathing. Dwyer's hands clenched involuntarily. Whitmore's face paled. Morton opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And in that moment, as the weight of her words settled over the room like a storm about to break, Naomi knew, they finally understood what was coming for them. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a truth no one had expected. Naomi Carter's words had sliced through the arrogance, the mockery, the smug indifference that had filled the air just moments ago. Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore sat motionless, their confidence stripped away like flesh from bone, their faces betraying the first flickers of fear. For the first time since this farce of a trial began, they weren't in control. Morton was the first to recover, but barely. His voice, once dripping with condescension, now carried a thread of uncertainty, as if he was trying to convince himself that the situation wasn't slipping through his fingers. Miss Carter, excuse me, you expect us to believe that you work for the CIA? He let out a hollow chuckle, attempting to regain ground. That's quite the claim, don't you think? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of what was coming. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her jacket pocket, her movements measured, controlled. The room tensed as if expecting something explosive, but what she produced was far more dangerous, a small, sleek leather case. She opened it, revealing a badge so unmistakable, so irrefutable, that even Morton took a step back. The CIA emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its presence undeniable. A sharp breath escaped from the defense table. Reynolds' face twitched, his mind already scrambling for a way out, but there was none. Dwyer shifted in his seat, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Whitmore, the oldest, the most seasoned, was the only one who didn't move. His hands were folded, but Naomi could see the stiffness in his jaw, the slow realization settling into his bones. The judge adjusted his glasses, squinting at the badge, then at Naomi, then back at the badge. The shift in power was palpable. The walls that had once seemed to close in on Naomi were now pressing down on the men who had spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable. Naomi's voice was calm, steady, but every word was a blade. You see, Mr. Morton, I'm not here to ask for justice. I'm here to ensure it. She turned her gaze to the officers, her expression unreadable. Did you really think this was just another case you could manipulate? Another moment where you walk away while someone else pays the price for your arrogance? Reynolds finally found his voice, but it was weaker than before. This is a joke. There's no way. Naomi cut him off with nothing but a look. Do you really want to finish that sentence, detective? Dwyer shifted uncomfortably. This is insane. What, you're saying this was some kind of setup? His voice was laced with something dangerous, desperation. You planned this? You tricked us. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her presence alone enough to make them shrink. No, Officer Dwyer. You did this to yourselves. You and your friends thought you could humiliate me, degrade me, treat me like I was beneath you. But you didn't realize who you were dealing with. She straightened, her eyes locking onto each of them, one by one. I've spent my career gathering intelligence on men like you. I know everything. Every complaint that was buried. Every falsified report. Every time you turned off your body cams. Every time someone mysteriously changed their testimony after a conversation with one of you. I have it all. Reynolds' composure cracked, his jaw tightening. You can't prove anything, he snapped, his voice lacking the authority it once carried. You think just because you flash a badge, you can, Naomi interrupted, her voice smooth, almost amused. You're right. I don't have to prove anything. She reached into her bag again, pulling out a thick, bound folder, and dropped it onto the table in front of her. The impact was louder than it should have been, or maybe it was just that the room was so silent that every sound felt amplified. It's already been proven. Everything you've ever done. Everything you've tried to cover up. Every person you've wronged. It's all in here. Dwyer went pale. You're bluffing, he whispered, but his voice shook. Naomi arched a brow. Do you want to take that risk? For the first time, the judge leaned forward, intrigued. Miss Carter, are you saying you have evidence of misconduct on behalf of these officers? Naomi didn't even look at him. She kept her focus on the men in front of her. I'm saying that the men sitting at that table have spent years believing they were above the law. And now, they're about to learn just how wrong they were. A heavy pause. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge seemed uncertain of how to proceed, caught between his own biases and the undeniable reality unfolding before him. The officers, 3 men who had once carried themselves with the unshakable confidence of those who knew they would never face consequences, looked as though the floor beneath them had cracked open. Then, the doors to the courtroom opened. Naomi didn't turn, but she already knew what was happening. The sound of footsteps echoed through the space, measured, purposeful. The kind of footsteps that carried authority. The kind that made men like Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore instinctively straighten their backs. A voice rang out, crisp, no nonsense. Detectives Reynolds, Dwyer, and Sergeant Whitmore, stand up. Reynolds' breath hitched. Dwyer blinked rapidly. Whitmore clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Slowly, all 3 men turned in their seats. And there, standing at the entrance, were 2 agents, real agents. Federal agents. Men whose presence alone meant that the situation had escalated beyond anything the officers could talk their way out of. One of them held up a warrant. You're under federal investigation. As of this moment, you are relieved of duty. Naomi finally turned, finally looked them in the eyes. She took in the panic, the disbelief, the realization that, for once, there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. You wanted to humiliate me, she said, her voice quiet but deadly. But you were never playing the game you thought you were. Reynolds opened his mouth, to protest, to threaten, to bargain, maybe, but before he could say a word, the agents moved forward. Handcuffs clicked. And just like that, the men who had spent their lives believing they were untouchable were led away like criminals. Naomi watched them go, her expression unreadable. And for the first time since she had walked into this courtroom, she allowed herself to breathe. The courtroom was still. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural, suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath. Naomi watched as Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore were hauled to their feet, their bodies rigid, their expressions shifting from disbelief to anger, then finally to something that looked dangerously close to fear. The moment their wrists were locked in handcuffs, the weight of reality crashed down on them in real time. The men who had spent their careers wielding power, deciding fates with a smirk and a shrug, were now on the receiving end of the very system they had once manipulated so easily. Reynolds' face darkened, his body stiff with defiance as he gritted his teeth. This is bullshit, he spat, twisting against the grip of the agent holding him. You think you can do this to me? I know people. You hear me? You don't get to do this. His voice, which had once carried the weight of authority, now sounded desperate, hollow, like a man clinging to a reality that no longer existed. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her arms crossed over her chest as she regarded him with an unreadable expression. I think you misunderstand your situation, detective, she said, her voice calm, measured, and sharper than a blade. You're not the one in control anymore. Dwyer's breathing was ragged, his eyes darting between Naomi and the agents as if searching for some loophole, some way out. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "This isn't happening. This is a mistake." He turned toward Morton, who was standing frozen, his mouth slightly open, his entire body radiating disbelief. "Morton, do something. You know damn well this isn't right." Morton blinked, his throat bobbing as if he wanted to speak, but for the first time since this trial had begun, he had nothing to say. Naomi saw it clearly, the moment he realized he had bet on the wrong side. The way he was suddenly calculating, trying to determine just how much damage this revelation had done, not just to his case but to his own career. Whitmore, the oldest of them, had remained quiet the entire time. But Naomi saw the way his jaw was clenched so tightly that a vein in his temple pulsed. Unlike the other two, he wasn't panicking, at least not outwardly. He was a man who had spent decades believing in his own invincibility, and now, for the first time, he was realizing that shield was gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "You think this changes anything?" His eyes locked onto Naomi, and there was something dark there, something that made it clear that if circumstances were different, if they were anywhere else, he wouldn't hesitate to make her regret this moment. "You think because you pulled some strings, you've won? You think this is over?" Naomi took a step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her presence commanding enough that the entire room seemed to shrink around her. She met Whitmore's stare head-on, unflinching, unapologetic. "Oh, it's far from over," she said, her voice smooth but weighted with certainty. "In fact, this is just the beginning." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head even as the agents tightened their grip on him. "You really think they're gonna let this stand?" His smirk was forced now, desperate, as if clinging to the remnants of his former arrogance. "The department, the union, hell, the whole damn system is built to protect men like us. You think a couple of federal agents are gonna change that?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something almost sinister. "You might have embarrassed us today, but you and I both know how this works. We don't stay down for long." Naomi didn't react immediately. She let him talk, let him grasp at his fading sense of control, let him believe, for just a few more seconds, that there was still a world where he could escape this. Then, she exhaled slowly, tilting her head as if considering his words. "You're right about one thing," she said. "The system is designed to protect men like you." Reynolds smirked again, as if that alone proved his point. "But here's what you don't understand," she continued, her tone shifting, darker now, laced with something dangerous. "The system doesn't work the same way when the people protecting it decide you're no longer useful. And after today, after everything that's about to come to light, you're nothing but a liability." She took another step forward, lowering her voice just enough that only they could hear her. "The same people you're so sure will protect you. They're about to turn their backs on you so fast, you won't even have time to beg for mercy." Dwyer's face twitched, his mask slipping completely. "That's bullshit," he muttered, but the doubt had already started creeping in. Naomi arched a brow. "Is it?" She took her phone out, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up for them to see. The screen showed a live feed from a well-known news channel, the breaking news banner flashing red across the bottom. "Federal investigation launched into officers accused of racial profiling, falsified reports, and excessive force." Reynolds went pale. Dwyer's mouth parted slightly, his breathing shallow. Whitmore didn't move, but Naomi saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "You're not just facing an internal review," she continued, her voice quiet but sharp as a knife. "You're about to be dragged through every headline in the country. Your names, your histories, every single complaint that was swept under the rug, it's all going public. And trust me, no one wants to be seen defending men like you when the whole world is watching." For the first time since this had started, they looked truly afraid. The agents didn't wait for them to process it. "Let's go," one of them ordered, yanking Reynolds toward the exit. As they were pulled away, Reynolds struggled one last time, his voice frantic now. "You think you're safe?" His eyes locked onto Naomi's, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. "You have no idea what you've started." Naomi didn't move, didn't break eye contact, didn't flinch as she delivered the final blow. "I didn't start this," she said, her voice like ice. "But I damn well finished it." The doors swung open, and just like that, they were gone. The courtroom remained frozen in place, as if struggling to process the shift that had just occurred. The judge cleared his throat, but it was clear even he was unsettled. The spectators murmured in hushed voices, some stunned, some in awe, others whispering about how they had just witnessed something they never thought they'd see. Naomi turned, her gaze finding Morton, who still stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his face unreadable. He knew, just as well as she did, that this case had slipped through his fingers. He had stood on the wrong side, defended the wrong people, and now, the entire foundation he had built his reputation on was crumbling beneath him. She stepped past him without another glance, walking toward the exit, her posture as strong as it had been when she first walked in. But this time, there was no weight pressing down on her shoulders. No uncertainty about what would happen next. Because for the first time, she wasn't the one walking away in chains. The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after the courtroom doors slammed shut behind the disgraced officers. Naomi stood still for a moment, breathing in the silence that had replaced the jeers, the mockery, the smug laughter that had once filled this space. It was gone now, stripped away by the undeniable reality of consequence. The people who had spent years abusing their authority, bending the system to their will, had finally met something they couldn't manipulate, the truth. She turned slowly, scanning the faces in the room. Some were stunned, others looked away, unwilling or unable to process what had just happened. She could see the shifts in their expressions, the calculations forming behind their eyes. There were those who had assumed she would fail, who had dismissed her as just another black woman shouting into the void, another name to be buried under the weight of bureaucracy. And now, those same people were watching her in a different light, recalibrating their opinions, trying to decide how to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the reality they had been so comfortable accepting. At the prosecutor's table, Morton still stood frozen in place. His fingers twitched slightly, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He wasn't looking at her, but Naomi could feel his mind racing, desperately searching for a way to salvage what was left of his case, his reputation. He had walked into this courtroom fully convinced of his own authority, believing that he had the upper hand simply because the system had always worked in his favor. But now, the case was slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of a story that was already being rewritten. Naomi took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I bet you thought this was just another case for you," she said, her voice even, controlled. "Just another name on a file. Another moment where you could twist the narrative in whatever direction suited you best." She let the words settle, let him absorb the weight of them. "But you miscalculated, Morton. You underestimated me. And now, you're standing in the middle of a mess that you helped create." Morton's throat bobbed as he swallowed, finally forcing himself to meet her gaze. There was something different in his expression now, something wary, something almost regretful. But Naomi didn't let herself dwell on that. Regret didn't erase complicity. His voice was lower when he spoke, lacking the confidence it had carried earlier. "I didn't know," he admitted, but there was no conviction behind the words, only an excuse. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Didn't you?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then, exhaling sharply, he straightened, regaining just enough composure to put up a last, weak defense. "The law isn't as simple as you want it to be," he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "Sometimes, things aren't black and white." Naomi let out a small, humorless laugh. "No, Morton. You just prefer it when things stay gray. Because gray gives you room to maneuver. Gray lets you turn a blind eye when it's convenient. Gray lets people like you look the other way while men like Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore destroy lives without consequence. His lips pressed together into a thin line. He didn't respond. Naomi took another step closer, lowering her voice. But today, you don't get Gray. Today, you don't get excuses. She paused, letting the tension stretch. So tell me, Morton, are you really going to keep standing on the wrong side of this? Or are you finally going to do something that actually resembles justice? A flicker of something passed through his eyes, hesitation, doubt, maybe even the smallest hint of shame. But before he could answer, the doors of the courtroom burst open again. Naomi turned just as a group of reporters flooded the room, their cameras already rolling, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of shouted questions. The news was spreading fast. She had known it would, but she hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. The moment the first cuffs had snapped around Reynolds' wrists, the dominoes had already started falling. She barely had time to process the flood of energy before someone was pushing through the crowd, moving with a sense of urgency that sent a pulse of warning through her. A woman, sharp-eyed, dressed in an impeccably pressed suit, her movements precise, controlled. Naomi knew that kind of walk, that kind of presence. Government. The woman stopped just in front of her, barely sparing Morton a glance before her focus locked onto Naomi. "Ms. Carter," she said, voice clipped, efficient. "We need to talk. Now." Naomi didn't react immediately. Instead, she studied the woman, taking in the barely hidden tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides like she was resisting the urge to move faster. "Who are you?" Naomi asked, though she already had a good idea of the answer. The woman's expression didn't change. "Someone who's trying to make sure this situation doesn't get even messier than it already is." Naomi arched a brow. "Messy for who?" The woman didn't answer, but she didn't have to. The truth was already written in the way she held herself, in the way her gaze flickered, just for a second, toward the cameras that were still rolling. The system was panicking. Naomi let out a slow breath, her mind already running through the possibilities. She had known, from the moment she revealed her badge, that this wasn't going to be the end. Taking down 3 corrupt officers wasn't just a courtroom spectacle, it was a ripple in a much larger ocean. And now, the people who had let Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore operate unchecked for years were realizing that their own comfort, their own power, was suddenly at risk. She glanced at Morton, whose expression had shifted yet again. He wasn't looking at her anymore, he was looking at the woman, his mind working, calculating, considering the shift in dynamics. And in that moment, Naomi saw it clearly. He was at a crossroads. She turned back to the woman in front of her. "If this is an attempt at damage control, you're already too late." The woman's jaw tightened slightly. "That depends on what you do next." And there it was. The next move. The next test. Naomi had shattered the illusion of invincibility surrounding men like Reynolds. But now, she was being given a choice. Would she let the system pull her into the gray? Would she accept whatever offer was about to be placed in front of her, some backroom deal meant to quiet the storm before it spread too far? Or would she do what she had always done, burn the whole damn structure down if that's what it took to finally see real justice? She exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling deep into her bones. Then, finally, she spoke. "Let's talk." And with that, she followed the woman out of the courtroom, knowing that whatever came next, this fight was far from over. Naomi followed the woman out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floors, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She had seen this play before, had watched the system scramble to protect itself the moment it realized the fire was spreading too fast to contain. But this time, she wasn't just another spectator, she was the one setting the flames. The woman led her down a quiet hallway, away from the noise, the cameras, the chaos unfolding in real time. Naomi could feel the tension radiating off of her, the barely concealed urgency in her movements. Whoever she was, she had been sent by someone high enough to know that this situation was spiraling out of their control. They entered a conference room, the door clicking shut behind them. The air was thick with the scent of old coffee and government-issued desperation. Naomi didn't sit, didn't relax, didn't give an inch. She simply crossed her arms, waiting. The woman exhaled, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer before finally speaking. "You really know how to create a mess, don't you?" Naomi arched a brow. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I exposed 3 corrupt officers." "You'll have to be more specific." A sharp breath. The woman was trying to keep control, but Naomi could see the cracks forming. "You didn't just expose them. You exposed a pattern. A system. And you didn't do it quietly. The media is already running with it. Public pressure is mounting. Calls are flooding in, demanding action. And now, you've forced people who usually prefer to operate from the shadows into the spotlight." Naomi studied her, taking in every word, every movement. "Good," she said, her voice calm. "That was the point." The woman shook her head, stepping closer, lowering her voice. "You don't understand. This isn't just about Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore anymore. If this keeps growing, people far above them are going to start making decisions. And not the kind you want." Naomi let out a slow, deliberate breath. "So that's why you pulled me in here? To give me the standard, you've made powerful enemies speech? Because I promise you, I've heard it before." The woman hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Naomi to see it. The flicker of something behind her eyes. Worry? No. It was something deeper. A battle, maybe. A moment of internal conflict before she swallowed it down and pressed forward. "I'm here to offer you a way out," she finally said. Naomi's stomach clenched, but her expression didn't waver. "A way out?" The woman nodded, her voice controlled, rehearsed. "There's an offer on the table. You step away from this. Let it go. In return, certain doors open for you. Better opportunities. Protection. A future where you're not constantly looking over your shoulder." Naomi let the words settle, tasting them, analyzing them. "And what happens if I don't take the offer?" The woman's gaze didn't shift. "Then you make yourself a target." Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Inevitable. Naomi inhaled, slow and steady, then let out a short laugh, quiet, humorless. "You think threats are going to work on me?" The woman's jaw tightened. "I think you're smart enough to know what's coming if you keep pushing." Naomi stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her voice lowering to something almost lethal. "I don't scare easy. And I don't play games I can't win. If the system wants to fight me, tell them to get in line." The woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and Naomi caught it. The hesitation. The uncertainty. It was small, but it was there, and that meant something. "You don't have to do this," the woman said, quieter now. "You don't have to be the one who takes all the heat for this. Let someone else fight the battle for once." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "That's the problem. There is no someone else. That's how they win. That's how they've always won. They wait for people to get tired. To get scared. To be convinced that the fight isn't worth it. And that's how this cycle never ends." She took another step forward, her voice steady. "I'm not stepping away. Not this time." The woman held her gaze for a long moment, and for the first time, Naomi saw something else in her expression. Not just frustration. Not just duty. Respect. Then, finally, she let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. God damn it, she muttered under her breath. Naomi's lips quirked slightly. Not the response I was expecting. The woman let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Neither was this conversation. A beat of silence passed before the woman finally straightened, her demeanor shifting again, returning to something closer to the controlled presence she had walked in with. Fine. You made your choice. Just remember, once this door closes, there's no opening it again. Naomi's expression didn't waver. I never needed the door in the first place. The woman studied her for a long moment, then finally, she nodded. A small nod, barely there, but Naomi caught it. The slightest acknowledgement. The faintest trace of something almost like admiration. Then, without another word, the woman turned and walked out of the room. Naomi exhaled slowly, her mind already shifting to what came next. She had won the battle. But the war? That was just beginning. Naomi stood in the dimly lit hallway, her pulse steady despite the chaotic storm of thoughts roaring inside her mind. The conversation with that government woman still played in her head, echoing with each breath she took, the weight of her words settling into her bones. They had tried to offer her an easy way out, an escape disguised as a lifeline, a deal wrapped in the illusion of safety. They wanted her to walk away, to take the path of least resistance, to accept that she had done enough. But Naomi knew better. She had spent her entire life watching the system swallow people whole, promising fairness while tightening the noose. She had seen it strip away justice, silence voices, and erase the names of those who dared to stand against it. And now, she was supposed to believe that if she stepped back, the right thing would still happen. No. That wasn't how this worked. That was never how it worked. She exhaled slowly, her fingers twitching at her sides. Her body still buzzed with adrenaline, her mind still sharp, alert, calculating what came next. There was no turning back now. She had made a choice in that courtroom, one that couldn't be undone. The moment she exposed those officers, the moment she forced the system to acknowledge its own corruption, she became more than just a problem. She became a threat. A slow clap echoed through the hallway, the deliberate rhythm of someone who had been watching, waiting, assessing the destruction she had left in her wake. Naomi didn't turn immediately. She recognized that sound, that smug energy, that unbearable arrogance. When she finally did glance over her shoulder, her gaze landed on Daniel Morton. He was leaning against the wall like he didn't have a care in the world, arms crossed, his smirk sharp enough to cut. He was the kind of man who never let himself look rattled, never let the cracks show. But Naomi could see the shift in him, the subtle signs of someone who was beginning to realize he had backed the wrong side. That was quite the show in there, Morton mused, his tone dripping with something between reluctant admiration and barely concealed irritation. Gotta admit, Carter, you surprised me. I didn't think you had it in you. Naomi exhaled, turning fully to face him now, her expression unreadable. That's your problem, Morton. You never think people like me have it in us. His smirk didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something Naomi recognized as unease. And yet, here you are, standing in the aftermath of your own little revolution. He pushed off the wall, stepping toward her, his gaze sharp, calculating. Do you even realize what you've done? Naomi held her ground, her voice even, unwavering. I did what needed to be done. Morton let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as if she had just said something laughably naive. Is that what you think? That this was about justice? About doing the right thing? He stepped even closer, his voice lowering to something more dangerous. Naomi, the system doesn't break just because you throw a few punches. It bends. It twists. It adapts. You didn't destroy anything today. You just forced it to shift its weight. And trust me, that weight is about to come crashing down on someone. The question is, do you really think you're ready to handle that when it happens? Naomi didn't blink. Then I'll keep hitting it until it shatters. Morton studied her for a long moment, his smirk fading slightly, replaced by something more serious, something heavier. You think the people at the top are just going to let this go? That they'll let you walk away after what you pulled in there? Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice quieter now but carrying even more weight. Let me. She let out a small, humorless laugh. I don't need their permission. Morton scoffed, but there was something uneasy about it this time. Jesus, Carter. Do you really not see what's happening here? You rattled the wrong people. You might think you're untouchable because of that badge you flashed in there, but trust me, there are forces at play here that don't give a damn about your credentials. You think you exposed a few dirty cops? You think that's where this ends? These guys, Reynolds, Dwyer, Whitmore, they were disposable. Pawns in a much bigger game. And you just made yourself a problem for the people who actually matter. Naomi took a slow step toward him, her presence filling the space between them, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had already decided exactly how far she was willing to go. And what about you, Morton? Where do you stand in all of this? He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. Where I've always stood, right in the middle, trying to make sure I don't get crushed when the walls cave in. His eyes flickered over her, scanning her, as if trying to figure out whether she was the kind of person who would be standing when the dust settled. But you don't know when to stop, do you? Naomi took another step closer, her voice softer now, but no less sharp. No, she said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I don't. Morton let out a breath, something shifting in his expression, something closer to resignation. Then I hope you're ready for what comes next. Because trust me, this fight isn't over. Naomi smirked, just slightly, just enough for him to see that she wasn't afraid. It never is. Morton watched her for a moment longer, then shook his head again, muttering something under his breath before turning on his heel and walking away. Naomi stood there, the weight of everything pressing against her, but she didn't let it slow her down. The hallway stretched ahead of her, long and uncertain, but she didn't hesitate. She had chosen this path, and she wasn't going to stop now. Because for the first time in a long time, the system wasn't just watching her, it was afraid of her. And Naomi Carter wasn't done making it shake. The storm Naomi had unleashed did not settle quickly. The shockwave spread through the city, rippling through police departments, courtrooms, and newsrooms. The system had spent years pretending that men like Reynolds, Dwyer, and Whitmore didn't exist, turning a blind eye, sweeping complaints under the rug, burying evidence when it was convenient. But now, the whole country was watching, and the system had no choice but to respond. Reynolds was the first to break. After spending years believing himself untouchable, the reality of federal charges hit him like a freight train. He had spent decades twisting the law to his advantage, knowing that there would always be someone willing to protect him, but those protections evaporated the moment the headlines turned against him. His so-called allies distanced themselves, his former friends in high places stopped returning his calls, and suddenly, the man who had once laughed in Naomi's face found himself sitting in an interrogation room, facing a choice he never thought he'd have to make: go down alone or start talking. He talked. Reynolds spilled everything, not because he had suddenly developed a conscience, but because self-preservation was the only thing he had left. He exposed corruption that ran deeper than anyone had realized, naming officers, judges, even city officials who had played a part in covering up misconduct. His testimony set off a chain reaction of arrests, indictments, and resignations. He tried to negotiate a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, but there were too many bodies buried under his name. The system was willing to sacrifice him to protect itself, and so, in the end, Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Dwyer didn't handle it as well. Unlike Reynolds, he wasn't a strategist, he had always followed orders, always relied on the power structure to keep him safe. When that structure crumbled, he unraveled. He refused to take a plea deal, refused to admit fault, clinging to the belief that somehow, someway, this would all go away. It didn't. He was convicted on multiple counts of obstruction of justice and excessive force, sentenced to 18 years behind bars. Whitmore, the oldest of them, the one who had built his career on looking the other way, had the quietest fall. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't try to cut a deal. Maybe it was because he had already seen the writing on the wall. Maybe it was because, deep down, he had known this was coming for a long time. He pleaded guilty, accepted his fate, and disappeared into a prison cell with no fanfare, no outbursts, no last words of defiance. As for Morton, the prosecutor who had once stood against Naomi, his downfall wasn't as public, but it was just as inevitable. The exposure of police corruption led to scrutiny of the entire justice system, and Morton's role in protecting bad cops was no longer a secret. He wasn't charged with anything, but his reputation was destroyed. He resigned quietly, slipping out of the public eye, another casualty of a system that had finally started eating itself. And then, there was Naomi. She didn't disappear. She didn't step back. She didn't take the easy road that so many had expected her to take. Instead, she became something bigger than the case itself. She became the face of a movement, the name people whispered when they talked about change, the force that refused to let the world forget what had happened. The press tried to shape her into a symbol, but Naomi refused to let them define her. She wasn't interested in being anyone's hero, she was interested in finishing what she started. The department was forced to implement reforms, new oversight committees were established, and independent investigations into past cases were reopened. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was more than what had been there before. And Naomi? She wasn't done. She turned down every offer that came her way, the book deals, the TV appearances, the political endorsements. She didn't do this for fame. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And in the end, that was what scared the system the most. She wasn't looking for power. She was looking for justice. She walked out of that courthouse not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had forced the world to see what it had tried so hard to ignore. And as she stepped into the daylight, feeling the warmth of the sun against her skin, she allowed herself to do something she hadn't done in a long time, she smiled. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Sometimes, the people in power think they can do whatever they want, that their badges or titles make them invincible. They think that because the system has always worked in their favor, it always will. But here's the truth, no one is untouchable forever. Eventually, someone fights back. Eventually, the truth comes out. And when it does, the people who thought they were above consequences find themselves exactly where they never expected to be, at the mercy of the very system they built to protect themselves. So let me ask you this, what would you do if you were in Naomi's shoes? Would you have walked away? Would you have taken the deal? Or would you have done what she did, risked everything to make sure the truth was known? Think about that. And if this story made you feel something, anger, hope, frustration, inspiration, tell me in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if you want more stories like this, stories that shake you, stories that make you think, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because trust me, there's always another twist waiting to be told.